Welcome to another episode Beyond Perception. I'm Simon, and my guest today, Professor Timothy Owen Desmond. Welcome, Professor Desmond.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah,
I'm here to continue our conversation.
Yeah, me too. So we had a first conversation, and you introduced us to a couple of very profound themes: unified source of mind and matter, holographic universe, meeting archetypal psychology, the equation of the psyche. And for those of our listeners who have missed that first conversation, I just share a brief introduction of yours. You're a professor of philosophy at the College of Southern Maryland, the author of the book Psyche and Singularity, Jungian psychology and holographic string theory. And you're also offering a course called Immortality and the Unreality of Death, a hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics. So I'm excited to be here today with you again and dive deeper into this very interesting intersection of philosophy, psychology, and physics.
Yeah, I love to talk about this stuff, obviously. So I know briefly we talked before starting the video, and one idea was to maybe try to define the fundamental terms a little more clearly. And that's always a necessary part of philosophy. My favorite Western philosopher is Plato, who depicted his martyred mentor Socrates having conversations with the people of Athens about philosophical topics and always trying to get down to the fundamental definitions of things. What is courage? What is justice? What is the soul? What are these absolute ideas? And they never could do it because you can it's like an infinite regress of words that you can always define the infinite more perfectly. It's never going to be a perfect definition. The medium of words themselves can't fully define any absolute term. But that doesn't mean, according to Socrates' perspective, that we should give up trying to do it. But in that class, Immortality and the Unreality of Death, I talk about the Munchausen trilemma, which is an epistemological problem. If you try to define any fundamental term, it runs into one of three unacceptable avenues. The first is the infinite regress. You know, why does it rain? Because the water falls from the clouds. Well, why did the clouds form? Because water vapor condenses on dust particles, and it has something to do with cosmic rays, we're learning. And, oh, well, why does that? You know, it can go on forever, and there's no end to it. That's why the theologian Soren Kierkegaard said, at some point, we need to take a leap of faith in God, because reason will never be fully satisfied. So the infinite regress is one. Circular reasoning is another. You know, why is A true? Because of B. Why is B true? Because of C. Why is C true? Because of A. And it goes in a circle. And then the final one is you just at some point declare it to be a self-evident truth. Why is it true? It just is. It's the ground of being. There's no further depth to get under it to give a foundation. It just is a self-evident truth. So a lot of people have a problem with accepting self-evident truths. So with that preface, I will say that Plato and Carl Jung following him had a method of detecting these absolute ideas, which are impossible to define perfectly, by seeking the parallels or the mirror symmetries between the laws of the psyche or psychology and the laws of matter, physics. So that is the key strategy that they had for how physically embodied souls like us can gain access to these immaterial but more real forms of being. And it was to look for these parallels between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics. So to define the fundamental term now, to get back to the square one of defining fundamental terms, the book Psyche and Singularity was originally a dissertation entitled Psyche equals Singularity. And that is a translation of Carl Jung's leap day letter, I call it. So February 29, 1952, he wrote a letter to a man named J.R. Smithies, and he was writing about the problem of psychic energy. So Carl Jung learned about relativity theory from Einstein himself in Switzerland while both of them were living in Switzerland. So it's not that he was a complete novice. He learned from the horse's mouth. Mm-hmm. And he said, if psyche is energy, and if, according to Einstein, energy equals mass, E equals mc squared, the units of energy can be translated to the units of mass if you multiply the units of mass times the speed of light squared. They're equivalent terms, and that's the formula to equate the one with the other. So if psyche has energy, then it must have mass. Then why can't we measure it? So in a previous letter, he speculated maybe because the psychic energy is so tiny, we don't have instruments sensitive enough to measure it. And then he wrote this leap day letter, which I call it, because February 29 is leap day, it happens every 4 years. He said, maybe we can't detect psychic energy because it's infinite. And then he brought in relativity theory. If something travels at the speed of light, it disappears from space and time. According to special relativity, if you take any object with any mass at all and accelerate it close to the speed of light, well, he says it would be impossible because it would become heavier and heavier, and it would require an infinite amount of energy to accelerate something. But if you could do it, the internal clock for that object would stop. So time would stop for it, and it would contract in the direction of travel until it disappears at the speed of light. That's called length contraction. So time dilation and length contraction, that's special relativity. The faster you go, the slower time goes for you, and the smaller your extension in space is until it becomes zero for both. So then Jung theorized maybe psychic energy sacrifices extension in space by gaining infinite intensity. And he was totally writing in the context of special relativity and general relativity. He talked about the elasticity of space-time. And he concluded the letter with this equation: psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space.
And
the highest intensity is, and the smallest space is zero volume. And that's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So that can be translated as psyche equals singularity. So what is a psyche? What is a soul? A gravitational singularity.
Could you just repeat what you said about intensity? There was a little freeze, so I didn't fully understand.
Oh, okay, yeah. Intensity. So intensity for a wavelength of energy is the closer the wavelengths are to each other, the more intense it is.
Okay. So the higher the frequency.
Yeah, so the highest intensity, his definition for psychic energy is the highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity is infinite. Mm-hmm. That's when the wavelengths superimpose on each other. And he'd already, in that letter, talked about infinite intensity. So he was clearly thinking infinite intensity, and the smallest space is zero volume. It's a mathematical point. So if you have an infinite intensity of energy in a point of zero volume, that's the definition, according to general relativity, of a gravitational singularity, which is also undefinable. But at least you see the correlation that the laws of math point to the same unknowable point of infinite power that the laws of psychology point to, according to Carl Jung and according to Plato. Jung called it the unus mundus, or the God archetype, or the self, or the one. Plato called it the idea of the good, or he had Socrates describe it as the idea of the good. It's the source of light in the material world, and that means the source of everything, and it's the source of truth and consciousness in the psychic world. And the goal of education is to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, this infinitely brilliant source of all matter and all consciousness. And Jung's equation for that is psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, which can be translated to psyche equals singularity. And when you do that, then the laws of psychology and the laws of physics superimpose on each other perfectly. It's this point-for-point match that I believe we've reached this point in history where we have fulfilled the game plan Plato set out. For example, in the Republic, to study the ascending dimensions of the material world, linear arithmetic, two-dimensional plane geometry, three-dimensional solid geometry. Then the study of time is the periodic movement of three-dimensional solids, which is astronomy, planets orbiting, and vibrating strings, vibrating flutes. That measures time. And then when you see the mirror symmetries between those eternal mathematical rules that describe those ever-changing material objects, those mathematical eternal forms are like the shadows of the higher level of the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, and all of them originate from the ultimate idea of the good. But by studying these mathematical correlations between the mathematical forms and the physical objects we can see, and then seeing those mathematical forms as reflections of this higher order of absolute ideas of the soul, like justice and equality and beauty, we gradually open the eye of the soul. We acclimate this organ of knowledge, which he said is worth more than 10,000 physical eyes. And it's like coming out of the cave of shadows in the famous allegory of the cave, opening our eyes gradually to this brilliant idea of the good. At first, we can't see it because our eyes get blinded by the light, having lived our whole lives in this subterranean cave. But studying these mathematical forms was his prescribed method for perceiving the absolute truth. And to be able to define that idea of the good mathematically as a gravitational singularity seems to be the goal that Plato set the academic tradition out to achieve. And it seems to me Carl Jung in that letter, the Leap Day letter, kind of brought that to fruition. And then if you just translate it as psyche equals singularity, and then you add holographic string theory, which was developed after Jung died, then that really, I think, completes the picture. So it's an exciting time to be alive, because I think Plato's academic plan succeeded, despite the best efforts of some of the academics who helped bring it across the finish line, which is a great irony. Leonard Susskind is one of the founders of holographic string theory, and he presents it in an atheistic light, kind of as the absolute evidence against the idea of some intelligent cosmos. So that extreme irony to me is more evidence that the God archetype is behind this, because I think that's one of the attributes of God is irony. And certainly in Socrates, that's embodied. He's very ironic. I think God's very ironic.
It's very fascinating. So you mentioned a couple of terms. You defined psyche, but then also my question, does psyche equate consciousness, equates soul, equates God archetype?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of people define like spirit and soul, and there's these subtle differences. But psyche, I'm using the word soul, and that's the self. That each of us, I believe, and this is what Plato was teaching, is a reincarnating psyche or a reincarnating soul. That we inhabit these material bodies. We are one with these material bodies in the sense that we are one with all material energy. But this form that this material energy is temporarily taking, and it's ever changing. It's never the same from one second to the next. It's not like this is an enduring thing. This is a process that's always changing. The soul is eternal, and it's experiencing the illusion of change because we're embodied in these holographic illusions. But to get to holographic string theory, the bottom line for that theory, in a parallel with Plato, is it says that the past, the present, and the future, every bit of information that describes the whole history of the universe, is recorded at each point of this encompassing sphere, where from our perspective on Earth, space-time is expanding away from us in every direction at the speed of light. If you go beyond that border, you can't get back into the universe, because nothing can go faster than light, at least under normal circumstances. And holographic string theory says the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe is recorded at each point of this encompassing sphere as if on a holographic film, and it radiates back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on these elastic fundamental strings of energy. And that creates the three-dimensional illusion, which Leonard Susskind calls a cinematic hologram, a holographic movie.
So that means wherever you are, you're in the center of the universe?
Well, yeah, that is a implication of general relativity. Wherever you go, from your perspective, you're the center of an expanding universe. So wherever you go, from your perspective, you are the singularity of the Big Bang.
And I have another question. So what I'm hearing you say, you could say this transpersonal self manifesting through each one of us. And is that what you refer to as soul, or is this an individual-like expression of that God archetype? Is there a distinction, or do you refer to both, or the same as soul?
That is a fundamental philosophical question that gives birth to different branches of philosophy. In Hinduism, for example, one side, Shankara, would say the individual soul is like a doll made of salt. And if you put it back in the ocean, it dissolves back into the one. And this is this impersonal Brahman. But after Shankara, there was, this is the Vishnu worshipping branch of Hinduism called the Vaishnavas. In the Middle Ages, it was called the Vaishnava Reformation. And they said, no, there is some reality to the individual soul also. So Atman is the word for an individual, particular subjective perspective, a personal soul, like an individual self, a little atom of self-awareness. And Brahman is the ocean of waves of potential being. And Erwin Schrödinger, for example, one of the co-founders of quantum physics, said that particle wave of the Atman-Brahman equation is reflected in the particle wave paradox of quantum physics. If you observe a particle, it's there. This is the two-slit experiment.
So particle is Atman.
Yeah, the particle nature. So if the material world is a reflection of the spiritual world, which is this fundamental epistemological strategy that Plato set up and that Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, another co-founder of quantum physics, inherited. If that's the case, then what's the reflection in the material world of the individual soul, if there is such a thing? And then that would be quantum physics, particle and wave. The individual subjective personal side is there, but only under certain circumstances. And the impersonal wave merged in the ocean is the other side. And they're both simultaneously true, but they're mutually exclusive ways of looking at the same thing.
So it really depends on from where you are watching. If you are watching from a personal understanding, you see Atman.
Yeah, like if you observe a particle, it will behave like a particle. But if you're not observing it and then you detect its effects that it had, I think it helps just a real basic review of the two-slit experiment to kind of make it more tangible for people. So they notice that electrons sometimes act like waves and they sometimes act like particles. For example, if you have a flashlight and you shine it around the corner of a hall, a little bit of that light will go beyond the straight line that you would think would be blocking the light because it's a wave and it spreads out a little bit. Whereas a machine gun of bullets would only be able to go in a straight line. So the way they wanted to test whether an electron is a particle or a wave is they had an electron gun. They shot it through a wall with two slits very closely placed together, vertical slits, at a detector screen behind it. And I believe it was gold foil. It detects each electron particle hit. If it's a particle, then like a machine gun, the electrons should line up in two lines right behind the two slits. If you were shooting a machine gun at an iron wall, it would line up right behind those two slits. If it's a wave, it would go through both slits at once, then ripple into two new waves, which would interfere with each other as they moved forward. And you would have what's called an interference pattern, the ripple pattern of bright lines and dark lines, because parts of the waves amplify and other parts nullify each other. So you would have a series of bars of light and dark bands all across the span of the detector screen. But what they found was electrons are always detected as particles on the gold foil on the detector screen. But when they weren't observing which slit it went through, and this was the weirdest thing that they didn't expect, was those little particle hits would line up way to the right, way to the left, up, down. And after about an hour, the individual particle hits lined up in exactly the same interference pattern that a wave would have made all at once. So they did not, that was the beginning of quantum weirdness. Then they put an electron microscope at the two slits to see which one it actually went through. And when they did that, they lined up directly behind the slits like little bullets. So the implication was when no one was watching, they went through the slits as a wave. But as soon as they were watched by the gold foil, they collapsed into a single particle. Well, what kind of a wave does that? Water waves don't turn into particles when you look at them. And they came up with the realization that these waves are not material waves. They're waves of mathematical probability for where a particle might appear if that wave was to be observed, most likely at the peak. You take that wave and you multiply it by itself. It was the Schrödinger wave function. You multiply it by itself, and that gives you the wave of probability for where a particle might appear. So particles exist as statistical probabilities for a particle to appear. That is like the nature of Brahman. It's the potential state of all into any individual thing yet. But when you observe it, like self-reflection, then all of Brahman, the entire ocean of Brahman, collapses into a single point, which is your subjective point of view. In the history of the Vaishnava tradition, it went from Shankara's "there's only Brahman," at the other end was Chaitanya in the 16th century. And his slogan was Achintya Beda Beda Tattva, which is that God and the soul are inconceivably simultaneously one and different, or Atman and Brahman. And how can it be? And it's quite a claim to say that it's inconceivable. I mean, that's stating that you know something, and I know that you cannot form a conceptual explanation for how this could be. And the quantum physicists agree. We don't know how and why this could possibly be the case. It just is. Experiment demonstrates it. There's no reason why it should be that way. It just is.
So this is basically picking up on what you mentioned initially, what you called, I think, the Munchausen trilemma, that there's no final initial cause.
Well, there's no final initial way to use words or any kind of symbolic language to capture the ultimate cause of everything, because it's infinitely energetic, it's infinitely deep. In the class, this online class, what I say is that the Psyche equals Singularity does not overcome the Munchausen trilemma, but it neutralizes it because it is the same. The Munchausen trilemma, I say, is the God archetype manifesting in the realm of epistemology, which is the field of knowledge, studying what is knowledge, how do you gain knowledge. That's the study of knowledge itself. And I believe God manifests most precisely in the field of epistemology as the Munchausen trilemma. And I believe God manifests in the realm, at least in the realm that sees mirror symmetries between psychology and physics, in the Psyche equals Singularity equation, which is just another way of describing the Munchausen trilemma, because the gravitational singularity is an infinite regress. It's an infinitely deep gravitational well. And it's furthermore circular reasoning in the sense that the singularity is the beginning and the end of everything. Everything begins from the singularity at the Big Bang, and all of space-time returns to the singularity at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, which is infinitely energetic and therefore made of singularities. And if it doesn't make it all the way out to the horizon of the cosmos, that's because it got reabsorbed in the singularity in some black hole along the way. And there are black holes at every point of the underlying quantum vacuum. So here's another important point for the spiritual question of, are there individual souls Is there just one? And this was a philosophy professor, Robert Bruce Ware, wrote a book on Hegel. And he pointed out that Hegel's concept of the idea, which is just another word for God, Hegel himself says that Hegel's definition of the absolute idea is the same as a gravitational singularity, according to general relativity and according to quantum physics, which says that there's a singularity at every point of the quantum vacuum. Ware brought in the idea of Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. If you can't discern a difference between two things, they are identical. That just seems like a self-evident claim there. But if you apply it to gravitational singularities, it takes an interesting twist, because you can have black holes all over the place. And we've been observing their gravitational effects very closely since, God, when was the first photograph of a black hole? 10 years now. It's the new era of black holes are widely accepted. And you can't observe a black hole because space and time stop at the event horizon, but you can observe the gravitational effects, and they're obvious to see. So there's black holes everywhere in the center of every galaxy. There's small ones within each galaxy. Quantum physics says there's a tiny, tiny one at every point of space-time in the quantum vacuum. And there was the Big Bang singularity. So there appears to be innumerable different singularities, but they're all structurally identical, which is a point, a mathematical point. So you can't differentiate them by their structure, by their shape or their size. And they're furthermore all outside of space-time because of the laws of relativity theory. A point of infinite density is equivalent to a point traveling infinitely fast. Well, all you have to do is get to the speed of light, and space and time stop for you, as do the laws of physics. So they're all outside of space-time. Therefore, they can't be differentiated by their different appearances within space-time. So therefore, they're all one. They're many. They're manifesting in all different points of space throughout all ages. And yet they're all simultaneously, indistinguishably one. And that, I think, is the relationship between each individual soul and the supreme soul, or God. So Carl Jung believed in God. He said in those famous BBC lectures, and he was just before he died, he goes, I don't believe in God. I know. He goes even farther. But he would say that I might not be able to defend that in a scientific way, but personally, as a human being, I just know. I don't have any doubts, because all the synchronicities that he'd been through, the process of individuation, of becoming a complete person, but the strategy that he worked on with Wolfgang Pauli for observing these mirror symmetries, I think, although it can never fully prove you can never fully prove anything, I believe, with words. And I think most scientists agree with that. But you can test a theory again and again and again. And if it passes every time, it gives you a good reason to believe it's true. And I think these parallels between holographic string theory and Jungian Platonic Vedanta cosmology, they're so precise that it makes taking the necessary leap of faith a lot easier. It's like, I'm not just going to leap into some crazy, unsubstantiated cult mentality. I'm basing this on the academic plan that has been carefully carried out for 24 centuries. And it's come to this conclusion, just like Plato predicted. What are the odds that that's just an accidental coincidence? Not very high. Most likely this is true. And therefore I'm going to believe it. That's what I try to set out in the class, Immortality and the Unreality of Death. Like, if you need help to believe, just look at the evidence from the greatest minds that we've documented for 2,400 years, and I think it's convincing.
Fascinating. So there are a couple of follow-up questions. At first, so what I understand, Psyche equals a gravitational singularity. That could mean individual soul, it could be God soul, it encompasses both. And also equals consciousness. Before, when you talked about the allegory of the cave, you mentioned shadows. So, and also in a way, something or someone becoming more conscious or awakening from a shadow. How does that relate to this equation, if it does? What is unconscious?
All right. Well, it relates to this equation, the allegory of the cave, which is, I mentioned the two-slit experiment, which I think everybody should know. And I think also everyone should know the cave allegory. If you're going to get one thing out of Plato, it would be the cave allegory. So in Book 7 of the Republic, Plato starts out, at the end of Book 6, he has his divided line analogy. And I talked about this before. He took reality and he said, imagine a line divided into two unequal parts, one bigger, one smaller. Now divide each of those segments by the same proportion. He never gave the proportion. Some people think it's that proportion phi. I believe it's 1.6. It's the one that you find in nature everywhere. But at any rate, it's 4 segments. What is it?
I think it's the golden ratio, right?
Well, yeah, you're
1.6
right.
Something, yeah.
Yeah. So I've read articles where they believe he was alluding to that. But at any rate, the smallest segment at the bottom, if you look at this as a vertical line, is the material. So the bottom, you take a line, you segment it with a bigger section and a smaller section. The bigger section is the spiritual eternal world, and the smaller section is the physical temporal world. Then you divide each of those segments again by the same ratio. So you have 2 segments of the material world and 2 segments of the spiritual world. The smallest bottom segment of the material world is the world of shadows, 2-dimensional shadows and mirror reflections, like on the surface of a puddle of water. Those are reflections and shadows of 3-dimensional solid objects, like trees and people and physical things in the 3 dimensions of space. So that is the totality of the material world. Those 3-dimensional objects are like shadows or mirror reflections of the eternal mathematical forms, which is the lowest level of the spiritual world. Like all of the different triangles are a reflection of the Pythagorean theorem. You know, all of these right-angled triangles, they all follow the same archetypal rule as the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So the mathematical forms that describe the 3-dimensional physical forms, those are the lowest level of the eternal spiritual world, and they are like shadows or reflections of the highest level of the spiritual world, which are the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, which Carl Jung called the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So if you study these mathematical forms that are mirrored by the physical forms, then you're looking at the reflections of this higher order of form that you're trying to open the eye of your soul to see. And when you start to see these correlations, ultimately you'll open the eye of the soul to at the top of the line in a category all its own is the idea of the good. It's beyond being. It's the source of being, and therefore it's beyond existence itself. It's this ultimate thing to be seen. So then he takes this divided line analogy and he puts it in the cave allegory, which makes it a little easier to understand. And he says, imagine a prisoner taken down at birth to an underground cave and shackled head to foot and forced to look at the back wall of a cave. Behind the prisoner, and there's a line of them, is a wall that goes halfway up to the ceiling. Above the entrance to the cave, which is to the back of the prisoners, is a blazing fire. And guards walk back and forth in front of the wall so that their shadows are not cast on the back wall, but they carry puppets up on sticks, silhouettes, cut out objects like a tree or a rabbit or all the natural objects that you would see. And they walk back and forth, and the prisoners look at the shadows and they think that's reality. They see their own shadows of their own body and they think that's reality. They don't understand there's a 3-dimensional world. And they pride themselves on predicting which shadow will come in which sequence. And they get really excited about who's the best one at predicting, tree, it'll be tree, rabbit, ball, whatever. Then somebody comes down from outside the cave, cuts the shackles off of a prisoner, turns him around, and says, "Look, behold." But he can't see anything because the firelight blinds his eyes. He thinks he's going insane and that he's being attacked. Then that person drags the prisoner up the rough and steep ascent to the outer world. And then the sunlight really blinds this prisoner. And they're completely bewildered. And they wish that they could just be back in the cave and have comfortable eyes and see reality again. But gradually, the prisoner can see things at night, dimly in the moonlight, certain things. Then the prisoner can look in the puddles and see reflections of the moon and the stars. And then at the daytime, he can gradually open his eyes and see things until finally he can look at the sun itself directly, at least for a glimpse. And then he realizes, oh, that's the source of everything. And that cave was just this abomination. And then the person who freed him says, okay, now it's your turn to go back in the cave and return the favor and release another person. Then that person goes back in the cave. Now they can't see because it's too dark and they're bewildered. They can't see the shadows. Everyone thinks they're insane and blind. Mm. And when that person says, yeah, well, you're just looking at shadows. Come with me. I'll show you the light. They would rather kill that person than allow them to make them blind and insane as they appear to be. But then gradually that person's eyes get accustomed to the darkness, and then they can predict the shadow sequence 10,000 times better than any of the prisoners because they just turn around and they can see the guards lining up and they say, oh, okay, it's going to be, tree, rabbit, bush, rabbit, and they can list them. And that's just because they can turn their head and see. So that's the cave allegory. This world, says Socrates at the end of the allegory, is like shadows on the wall of a cave. As the shadows in the cave are to the people outside of the cave, so is this whole world of three-dimensional forms under the sun, just like shadows in a cave compared to the eternal world of absolute forms. And that the sun here is a reflection of the idea of the good, which is the source of everything. Now, Brian Greene, a famous string theorist, who supports Leonard Susskind and Gerard 't Hooft. Those are the two who came up with holographic string theory. He says holographic string theory seems to turn Plato's cave on its head because holographic string theory says the reality, the eternal forms are on the two-dimensional horizon of the cosmos. And the illusion is the three-dimensional, seemingly more real forms that we embody. He says Plato was right, but it seems to be reversed. There is a realm that's eternal, and this is a shadow of that realm, but that's two-dimensional, and this is three-dimensional. But then if you look into near-death experiences, for example, like the one Plato discusses at the end of the Republic, which also includes the cave allegory, or Carl Jung's, souls, when they die, they can leave the body, and they can go out to that horizon of the cosmos. It's literally where Carl Jung said he went in 1944. When he broke his foot, he had a heart attack. And then in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography, which came out in 1962, a year after he died, he said he rose above his body. He's looking down at his body, looking at the hospital, looking down at Earth. He's 1,000 miles up in space. He encountered this huge temple hollowed out from stone. A black Hindu was in the temple, and it was a brilliantly lit antechamber anyway. When he was forced to come back to his body, he says, it seems to me as if this three-dimensional world is an illusion projected from the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future are interwoven, that each of us lives in our own little box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. And out at that horizon of the cosmos, which he visited for 3 weeks at midnight every night after his near-death experience, that's where the archetypes are. He witnessed the marriage of Hera and Zeus and the garden of pomegranates, and all of the mythological forms exist out there in the state of the highest bliss. And Plato says, or he has Socrates say, when you die, your soul can go out to this outermost sphere, and that's where you'll see the absolute forms of justice and beauty if you've practiced philosophy. So that if the absolute archetypes, the absolute ideas are all superimposed at this horizon of the cosmos, then that equates the horizon of the cosmos with what Jung called the collective unconscious, which is a big correlation between physics and psychology. Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious mind. So this is all related to, is there an individual soul? Is there one supreme soul? The collective unconscious mind is the container of all the absolute archetypes or absolute ideas, and they all originate from the archetype of the self, or the unus mundus, or God, according to Jung. It's equivalent to Plato's idea of the good. And those absolute ideas are the source of reality, and they project this shadow world of the three-dimensional physical world that we are in.
Are you fed up of being paralyzed in a corset of rules and dependencies, seeing no way out because of doubts or senselessness, bumbling along numbly in your job, or just toiling away, believing that something is wrong with you, or simply swimming in the conformity soup? In other words, wasting your life waiting around? If that's the case, you came to the right place. The Art of Creating workshop is all about waking up from your trance and revealing without doubt the incredibly creative spirit lying within you, reconnecting with your unique intuition, and giving you powerful creative tools that empower you to create your life, regardless of the circumstances, the way you love it. Big words? Yes. But not even close to the reality and possibility of you. So sign up here now, let yourself be creatively blown away, and wake up to the wonder of you. So is then the collective unconscious equaling the universe minus my personal conscious awareness?
No, the collective unconscious contains your personal experience. The collective unconscious
but unconscious means that something I'm not conscious of.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You and I both are practically unconscious of everything.
That's why I'm just thinking. So yeah. The collective unconscious is everything minus what I'm conscious of.
I see what you're saying.
So the whole existence minus my own personal conscious awareness is collective unconscious.
Right. But I wouldn't subtract your personal individual experience. I would say the collective unconscious, even though you're conscious of it, it also contains your experience of consciousness.
Okay.
According to holographic string theory, every bit of information that describes anything that has ever or ever will occur in the three-dimensional volume of the universe is recorded perfectly at each point there. That's the reality. And our experience here is like a movie being played from the film out there. But that film, according to Carl Jung, also records subjective psychic experiences, which are correlated with these physical experiences. So the collective unconscious, the word unconscious is kind of deceptive, because the collective unconscious is all consciousness of everyone, including the so-called inanimate particles. Whatever an electron experiences is also experienced there simultaneously. So everyone's individual subjective perspectives are retained in perfect detail and experienced simultaneously. And that's the difference, I think, between the Supreme Self and each of us little individual selves.
So
God is all of us, but we are each only us.
So is there then a process of becoming more conscious? Wherever that might be?
Yeah, Carl Jung called it individuation. Hegel called it freedom. And Hegel, I've been working a lot with Hegel recently. He defines spirit as the opposite of matter. Matter, he said, the substance of matter is gravity. And the definition of matter is it's made of discrete parts and it's always seeking a center outside itself. And therefore it's not free because it's compelled towards something outside of itself. Spirit is also compelled toward a center, says Hegel, but it has its center in itself. And therefore it's free because it's self-contained and independent. And matter seeks its destruction in the ideal form of its own unity, which is spirit. So if you identify spirit with a gravitational singularity inside a black hole, that makes sense of what Hegel was saying, because all the discrete bits of matter do seek their destruction and therefore their ideal unity in the gravitational singularity. And the process of becoming self-aware, says Hegel, the best way to learn what spirit is, or psyche, is to contrast it with its direct opposite, which is matter. Plato said the same thing. Study these mathematical forms which describe the physical world. They are mirror reflections of the higher level of absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. If you want self-knowledge, you have to learn about these absolute ideas. And that's just a ladder to get you to the ultimate idea of the good, or the self, or the God archetype. So Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, they said the same thing. Plato said it, Hegel said it, Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung said it. And Pauli and Jung added the additional clue that the self archetype, the supreme self, is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So whenever a psyche is divided by opposing demands in life, like Carl Jung was between being a family man and having a stable income in the field of psychiatry, or branching out and developing his own theory of psychology, which was a risk. And he was pulled between these opposing demands. And then he started having dreams of mandalas, circles or spheres with a central point. So he said it was his empirical observation from his own psychoanalysis of himself and from his many patients that whenever humans are confronted with these conflicting demands, that the ultimate archetype to perceive which is to become enlightened, the idea of the good or the self, the unus mundus, it lures us toward the right path during dreams and fantasies with images of mandalas. So then I say, if the material world is a reflection of the psychic world, and the psychic image of a mandala is what emerges from the ultimate self archetype, where is the mirror reflection in the realm of physics? And that, I say, would be the gravitational effects of black holes. Because a black hole is nature's geometrically perfect mandala. It's literally a mathematical point encompassed by a two-dimensional sphere. It's not a physical object, it's a mathematical object. It has physical gravitational effects, but it itself is not a material thing. So it's a perfect mandala. And lo and behold, if singularity is in the center of black holes, if the black hole, the effects of it are the psychic, are the parallels of the psychic mandala images, that means the singularity in the center of a black hole is the self archetype, which is the psyche equals singularity equation. So for Carl Jung, keeping that in mind, the goal of individuation in life, he says, usually in the first half of life, you have to just make things happen. You know, you're compelled by your instincts to reproduce. Most people, you got to get a job. You got to embed yourself in society and get along with the rules and all the people and learn how to do that. Then after you've met at least the minimum requirements of the social demands and the demands of the species, in the second half of life, then he says you're going to want to withdraw from the demands of society and the instinctive demands of your species and say, I am not either one of those. I am unique. I'm my own individual person. And then you want to re-embrace society and the species after coming to the realization that everything comes from the self archetype, the mandala producing self archetype. And when you realize you are participating in this supreme archetype, as is everyone else and everything else, then that is a state of wholeness through the union of opposites, or individuation, self-realization, which is a continuous, you need to continuously revive it. It's not you get it once and you've got it, like riding a bicycle. It's a continual practice, but it's achieved by coming back to this supreme archetype and realizing your relationship with it. And we know from his own personal interviews, he called this God. So coming to a relationship with the supreme self is the goal of each individual self. And that supreme self, like, for example, in the class Immortality and the Unreality of Death, I talk about why did Jesus say, when someone asked him, Moses gave us 10 laws, how many do you give us? And he said 2. And the first is love God with all your heart and soul and strength. And the second is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. And I say that order is important, because if there is God and God is everyone, then to love your neighbor as yourself, you need to realize that you and your neighbor are all united in one supreme self. And if you do that, then your instinct of self-love should automatically apply to everyone else, because you instinctively love yourself. You don't have to try. You feed yourself. If someone tries to stop your breathing, you will instinctively fight to breathe and protect your own life. So we might have negative opinions about ourselves, but in the bottom line is we love ourselves enough to bring us these many years into existence. If you literally believe intellectually that we are all part of one supreme self, then that powerful instinct of self-love should expand, and you will love others without any kind of attempt or moral pride about it. I don't think anyone's proud of loving themselves. I mean, some people are. It seems ridiculous to me. It's kind of like, you got to love yourself. It's like, you already love yourself, probably too much, but it's a stable instinct. And if it can be projected onto others automatically, then that seems to be the state of mind that people like Jesus Christ were trying to pass along. And I believe it comes from believing fully that we are all part of one supreme self, which other philosophers would say, nope, that's absolutely wrong. There is no individual enduring self. It's a continuously changing process, and you're caught up in an ego.
So there's a individual process of becoming more self-aware, which is happening within what you call, or Jung calls, collective unconscious, which to my mind points at it's still all unconscious. So is there an actual process of becoming more conscious if it's happening with what is labeled as collective unconscious?
Right. Yeah, that's another important point that inevitably will come up in this conversation. And this is where I'm comparing Hegel and Jung. Hegel focused on the collective evolution of the human spirit in general, which is just a manifestation of God's spirit. So if the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, and if each of us has to go through a process of individuation, a process of self-realization, does that imply that God has to go through a process of self-realization? And if so, what does that say about God's omniscience? I thought God's perfect. God doesn't need to achieve anything. It's all achieved. So Jung talked about it, and Hegel talked about it, that Jung called it the pleroma, which he identified with the horizon of the cosmos. And Hegel just said, all of the phases of God's process of self-realization occur eternally and simultaneously. God does experience what we experience as a process of self-realization, but the difference is we experience it point by point, leaving the past and having not yet experienced the future, whereas God experiences each phase simultaneously. And it's continuously achieved, and yet at the same time, it's continuously occurring. I think one way to help understand that is the metaphor of a firebrand, a stick that you light on fire, and then you spin it in a circle rapidly. If you spin it really quickly, it looks like a continuous circle. If you were to spin that at an infinite rate, it actually would exist at each point simultaneously. But it wouldn't be a static circle. It would be accumulating at each point an infinite number of times at each instant. And I think that's more like God's process of self-realization. It's occurring at an infinite rate so that God is infinitely more self-aware at each moment in such a way that when he achieves, or she, or however pronoun you want to put on God, achieves, it's achieved at an infinite rate and therefore thrown into the infinite past so that it always was. So that God can cheat the paradox of being predetermined and fixed and evolving and improving by doing it at an infinite rate, thereby overcoming this polarity. But we experience it bit by bit, gradually, each of us as an individual. And then Hegel would say God experiences self-realization through the evolution of nations from one people to the next, that the human species is carrying on a reflection of God's process of self-realization toward the end of history, or the ultimate state, which is God realized. Because in a God realized state, if you can show the laws of the state are rooted in the archetypes of the collective unconscious, or the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, then the people, in obeying the laws of the state, they know I'm only obeying my own inner law. I can see through reason that that law is directly rooted to this archetype of justice, which is imprinted on my soul. So when the state forces me to obey this law, I'm not being oppressed. I'm just being asked to follow my own law, and that is freedom. Obeying your own law is freedom for Hegel. And that's only possible on a national level if the laws of the state truly are rooted in these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. And that's an individuated state, which is a reflection of the individual. So the psychology of the individual is paralleled by the psychology of the nation. Hegel and Jung both agreed with that, as did Plato in the Republic. The whole dialogue is based on the assumption of, if we want to find justice in an individual soul, let's expand the project and imagine an ideally just city-state on the assumption that the city is an expanded version of the individual. It'll make it easier. And then in the Republic, they develop the ideally just city, to do which you must have the ideally enlightened leaders, the philosopher king, and the process of educating them is perceiving these mirror symmetries between the mathematics of the material world and the absolute ideas. And it all comes back to the idea of the good, which I'm saying is the gravitational singularity. And that, which is broad academic physics and psychology and philosophy, full circle back to Plato. And from a Hegelian perspective, I believe that is the process of God's self-realization through the evolution of nations, because we've come full circle back to the original template of Western civilization, which really closely mirrors the Vedanta philosophy of India, Plato's philosophy and the Vedanta philosophy of India, like the Bhagavad Gita. It's practically identical. So it seems like we're at an alpha and omega point in history, just in time too, because it seems the weapons of mass destruction are stronger than ever. Technology like AI, now they're saying that could destroy us. There's all these major technological threats to the species' survival. Carl Jung would say, at those kinds of situations in an individual, you get compensated by the collective unconscious. When you're that gravely endangered, the collective unconscious compensates you. It shows you the path towards survival. And I believe the potency of the parallels between this psyche equals singularity, this holographic string theory description of the cosmos, which can be reduced to the singularity, and the Platonic Jungian cosmology of the union of psyche and cosmos. Those parallels are so precise that I think that kind of precision is required as the appropriate antidote to the grave dangers that we are approaching. And it's that kind of intense, in your face, here it is, believe in this, this is real. Because if you can't all get your mind's focused on one point, then the destructive forces will bury, the light. And that's where I kind of see where we are right now. That we're in a horribly dangerous situation, and right on time, this brilliant light to guide us out is there, and it's available. That sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, but I've just translated Carl Jung. I can always fall back. I'm like, I didn't make up Psyche equals Singularity. That was Carl Jung.
Yeah.
And he's time-tested genius. So
a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe as a last question, is that what you now just shared a synchronicity? Things coming together in a way beyond rational or logical or linear understanding?
Yeah, I would say so. Actually, I do say so in the class, Immortality and the Unreality of Death.
And maybe maybe to complete our conversation for today, and I think we will have, if you like, more to follow up in another conversation possibly, but what is a synchronicity? Is there a science to synchronicity?
Yes. Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli specifically worked together on that idea of synchronicity. So Pauli experienced them comically, as was well known in the physics community, that whenever he would show up, experimental equipment would break down. It was like this magical thing. That there was one story, I forget the other physicist involved, but he locked the door and he would not let Pauli in his laboratory because he's like, yeah, I'm not letting you come in here, and things are going to explode. And then he was driving a train, a subway past, and things broke anyway. But at any rate, synchronicities, seemingly symbolically meaningful correlations that aren't connected in any kind of causal mechanical way. And I think most people.
What do you mean by that causal way? So we don't know how that happened.
Well, yeah, physical causality. It's like and the idea of, is there such a thing as cause and effect? David Hume brought that up. It's not empirically observable, but most people would say, if I tap on this, I'm causing that sound by connecting my fingernail to this plastic cover.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a physical cause. But if I'm thinking of synchronicities that I've had in my life, but it kind of reveals the private nature of my life. But to use Carl Jung's most famous example of the scarab beetle, he was analyzing a patient. She's sitting on the couch. He believed she was suffering from what he called this Cartesian problem, René Descartes. He said there's a rational spiritual world made of souls that are thinking but not extended in space. And then there's the irrational unconscious material world that is not thinking but is extended in space. And there's no connection between them. And this woman was very rational and not wanting to believe in the archetypes of the collective unconscious, which Carl Jung was trying to educate her about to help her achieve psychic wholeness. And he had come to a standstill and he didn't know what to do. She was telling him about a dream she had about a golden scarab piece of jewelry that someone gave her in a dream. And as she was saying the dream, Jung heard something buzzing against the screen of the window or against the window. I don't know if there was a screen. At any rate, he went to the window and he noticed this beetle was banging against the window, which he thought was weird because usually insects want to go from the dark to the light. But this one was going from the light, trying to get into a dark room. So he opened up the window. He caught the beetle. It wasn't a scarab beetle, but it looked like it. And there's the beetles that kind of look metallic. They're like green and they're kind of shiny. I think it was one of those. And it looks kind of like a scarab. And he presented the beetle to the woman. He said, here's your scarab beetle. And the coincidence of her talking about a beetle, a scarab beetle, and then this strange looking beetle that wasn't normally seen in that part of Switzerland, according to Jung, snapped her out of her Cartesian rigidity of thought. How is it that some seemingly unrelated event of me describing this and this insect just freely entering the room? It wasn't like I had some pheromones to which the insect was attracted and drew it over here. that would have been a physical causation. It was just me speaking about it. There's some symbolic connection here. It implies that the universe is listening and orchestrating itself to communicate symbolically through arranging physical events to occur in an appropriate time. So synchronicities, how do you explain them scientifically? Because Wolfgang Pauli, one of the co-founders of quantum physics, responsible for the current laws of chemistry, Nobel Prize winning super genius, he'd experienced them. And one important point about synchronicities is that they all point to the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, the ultimate archetype, because they indicate a union of meaning perceiving minds and unconscious matter. Because it seems as if material events unfolding in their natural course in the material world correlate to the symbol perceiving mental world in a meaningful way. And if you can, all of the pairs of opposites can be categorized as either mental or physical, like happy and sad, that goes in the mental category. Hot and cold, that goes into the physical category. Well, that, experiencing hot and cold, that's a subjective thing. At any rate, there's a material world and a spiritual world, and synchronicities imply the union of the two. So they all point to this ultimate archetype. So anytime you get any synchronicity, it has two meanings. It's related to the specific situation that's confronting you, and it's pointing to the overall union of all opposites, the self archetype. And when I experience synchronicities, I get a feeling, a sense of the numinous of the presence of this mysterious and all-knowing force, because how else could you account for it? And one way to account for synchronicities is that all of our minds and all of the material events that ever have occurred or will are all superimposed at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. So our meaning perceiving minds and all of the material events that ever occur, including the synchronistic union of the two, they're all superimposed at this horizon of the cosmos. There is a connection between meaning perceiving minds and material events. They're originally connected, and they're projected as this holographic movie. And just like a movie, synchronicities happen. Oh, it's perfectly timed, almost like a movie. Well, I believe this is a movie, and all of those events are already united at this horizon of the cosmos, which I believe is just a definition of one aspect of God. So the central singularity correlates to the conscious ego, and the horizon of the cosmos is the collective unconscious. But as you said, wherever you go in the universe, you're the center from your perspective. So from our perspective on Earth, the horizon of the cosmos is way out, 15 billion light years, I believe, at any rate, many, many billions of light years away. But if you're out there on a planet that we perceive there, then you see yourself as the center, and Earth is at this infinitely energetic horizon of the cosmos. But the union of this central singularity or conscious ego and the collective unconscious, and this dynamic relationship between how they can flip into each other, that is God. So I take the psyche equals singularity equation, which represents the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, and then you can break each side down into its constituent pair of opposites. So psyche is conscious ego and collective unconscious. Singularity is the singularity and the encompassing horizon. So I equate the subjective ego side of the psyche with the central singularity, and the collective unconscious side of the psyche with the cosmic horizon, on the understanding that it's one unit. They're not two separate things. And that's the cosmology that I think synchronicities can be explained in. And I believe they all point to this archetype of the self. And when you have these meaningful correlations of symbolic events that seem to be somehow underscored or affirmed by symbolically related physical events, it guides you, I think, on the appropriate life path if you interpret them and look for them. And I think it gives you a little glimpse of a kind of a direct touch from God. To be communicated with like that, it seems like a privilege. It's like, wow, you orchestrated the entire history of the material universe just to answer my personal problem. It seems like that. So I think that answered the question as best I could anyway.
Thank you very much for this very insightful conversation, insight
Oh, yeah,
into
sure. I love it.
psychology,
Yeah.
meeting philosophy, meeting physics.
Right. Yeah. I've got
And
to chain people to a bar stool if to get them to listen to me for this long. So I appreciate
and
it.
what I think with the last conversation, we also put into the show notes and details below this conversation the link to the course you're offering and your book, and we will do the same for this conversation.
Okay, great. Yeah,
And
yeah, that'll be great. I appreciate it. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's it's a theme or conversation which is a door to infinitely more. That's my
like I said,
sense. Yeah.
Singularity, that's infinity. So there'll never be a lack of topics to discuss surrounding this subject. It could goes on and on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here again for another conversation. I wish you well, and I look forward to a next encounter, a conversation, and also to everyone who is listening. Thank you for being with us. Stay curious and true to yourself, and see you next time.
Simon. Yeah, we'll do it again.